Welcome, I'm Diane, and I go out for walks and record what I see in my nature journal. I recently visited the Isle of Skye in Scotland, and as it is a very magical place, I wondered if I could add some glitter and sparkle to my nature journal. I need something to help me, and I think this might be it. I have a stash of art materials that I never use, but it's time to change all of that. I bought these paints quite a while ago and I never even opened the packet, so let's explore what I can do with them. Here is my book of experiments. I've already made a few videos about the pages I've created in this journal, and each page is an adventure. Links to a playlist are in the description below. When I go for a walk, I take photos to use as a reference for my drawings later. This red admiral butterfly I saw resting on a wall, and this will make a great subject. I can add iridescence to the wings. Here are some of my photos of the Fairy Glen in Skye. I want to paint this landscape but add some glitter and highlights to it using the paints. My other subjects are this red clover, a bee and a foxglove. And I'm going to see what these paints can do. I'm trying out different types of paper, different subjects and different ways of using the paints. But first, let's look at some paper I've never used. This is watercolour paper, and it's cold pressed watercolour paper, which means it has quite a rough surface. And this is one of the things I've bought and not used yet, so let's give it a go. It's glued at the edges, so you need to release it from its pad. The image shown on the left is smooth hot pressed paper, and that's the type of paper that I have in my journal. The one on the right is the paper I'm going to try and use. I sometimes do this when I want to try out a different type of paper in my journal. I cut it to size and then attach it to the page. I also like to cut different sizes because some of them I'll be using as swatch sheets and they can go on the left-hand page. This is a great way of adding different papers to this journal. Rough or cold pressed paper is very different to smooth. It has very different qualities and I want to try it out with the watercolours. What I also like about doing this is that I can move the layout around before I finally attach it to the journal. You'll see what I mean later in the video. These paints are from Daniel Smith, and it's the Jean Haines All Shimmer set. The set came with this square of black card to try out the paints on. Apparently they're more effective on a dark background, so I'm going to try them out using different paints and different backgrounds. Here are the colours: iridescent electric blue, iridescent ruby, iridescent Aztec gold, iridescent topaz, iridescent copper, and pearlescent white. I'm mixing in a fair amount of water with this square brush. Let's try them out on the paper that was provided in the set. Apparently you can see more of the shimmer when they've dried. I don't have any more of the black paper, so I'm going to create some swatches of my own. I'm using Winsor & Newton Payne's Grey as one of the backgrounds. I'm also using Winsor & Newton Ivory Black. I'm going to let these dry and then swatch the shimmer paints on top. After I've left it to dry, I'm going to swatch the colours again. Then I'm leaving it to dry. Let's have a close-up look and really zoom in. You can see that the paint sits on top of the other paint, and it really does shimmer. I like the electric blue, but the pearlescent white also looks interesting. I label my swatches so I can remember what I did and the colours I used, and this is useful to add to my journal. I did some research and I found that the other way to use these paints is to use the wet on wet technique. I sprayed the paper first with water. I wanted to try and make it look like a nighttime sky. So I used Prussian blue, copper and ruby and then left it to dry. And this is how it looks after drying. I'm going to do the same again using different colours. Even if you decide not to paint anything, this is a really fun thing to do anyway. And I find that I use the materials that I've just left in a drawer somewhere, even if I don't go on to do a painting. Here's the second swatch after it's dried. Let's move on to an actual painting. So I'm going to do the Red Admiral butterfly. I drew it in pencil first and went over that with pen. This is the rough cold pressed watercolour paper. I found that I couldn't remove the pencil lines no matter how hard I tried. So that's something to bear in mind for later. I then added this very dark background in Payne's Grey. I went over the top with ruby, copper and then pearlescent white. The pearlescent white didn't show up as much as I wanted it to. So in the areas where I thought it would be better to have a more vibrant white, I used gouache and then went over the top of that with the pearlescent. I left it to dry in between each layer of paint. The patterns on the Red Admiral butterfly are really interesting. When you look really close, there's these white marks around the edge, but there's also these black dots in the middle of the red bits. I couldn't erase the pencil lines. I decided to go around the butterfly with a contrasting colour, and I used this very vibrant green. I used the electric blue colour to do the markings on the side and at the bottom of the wings. The butterfly has a really shimmery look to its wings, and I was trying to make it look like that. So I added on a bit more of the pearlescent white. Here's what it looks like up close. This next painting was really fun to do. And I learned my lesson from last time and used a watercolour pencil to mark an outline. It dissolves in the water and you can't actually see it. I used this really big brush to add on a lot of paint and let it flow into the water. This is Prussian blue. This is cadmium-free yellow, and I added it to the bottom and let it flow into the blue. I then went on to a smaller brush and added some of the copper, as well as the electric blue. I ended up not liking this first layer, but it was an interesting start. And what I really liked about this paper was it held a lot of water and you could keep adding on layers and it didn't really affect it. So here I'm spraying it again, and because I didn't like what was underneath, I just went over the top. I was experimenting with what I could do with all the colours. I wasn't colour matching the landscape, I just wanted it to look really vibrant with lots of shimmer, and I enjoyed using this electric blue. I used the watercolour pencil to mark any outlines and it disappeared when I added the water. Here I'm adding in the outline of one of the fairy rings. It goes without saying that I'm not a landscape painter. I was just being playful and finding out what the paints do. I like to add landscapes in the background, and you'll see at the end how I do the layout. The copper actually stood out quite well against the blue background. And I created a silhouette of some of the rock formations that you'll see at the Fairy Glen. At this stage I wanted to add some white back in. I often use this product. It's P.H. Martin's Bleed Proof White. I wanted to make it look as if the sun was rising over the horizon. I left it all to dry. I wanted to see if I could add a glaze over the top. This is Hooker's Green. I want to make it look as if the rock formation is casting a shadow over the fairy ring. And then on the other side I added in the cadmium-free yellow. At this point the painting was very vivid and bright. I wanted to test how strong the paper was. The next stage was quite radical. I sprayed the whole page with water and dabbed off a layer of paint before going in with some darker tones. This didn't affect the paper at all. In fact, it was still in fairly good condition. I added in silhouettes of vegetation. I wanted to add in some shapes in the foreground. And there was a type of grass growing on this landscape. I used this very long brush to add it in. I created two paintings off camera on smooth watercolour paper so I could get more detail. I wanted to use the pearlescent white over the top after they've dried. The pearlescent white was more difficult to mix in the water. In the end I used a very fine brush to add these dewdrops on top of the red clover. You can see them in the photograph. I also painted this bee, and I wanted to add the pearlescent white to its wings to give them a shimmer. I realised I hadn't used the iridescent topaz, so I added that to the green around the edges. And for the foxglove, I also used the pearlescent white to see if I could give it a shine. The topaz looked really good on the green. And at this point, I'd used all the different methods and different types of paper, but now it's time to put it all together. I like to keep the swatches as well as the final paintings. It helps for later on to know how I created the look. I take all my paintings and try out where they look best on the 2 pages. I want this journal to be a record of all the paintings I've done. They're not necessarily the best paintings I've ever done, but I learned so much from each one of them. I usually put the swatches on the left-hand page, and if they don't all fit, I may leave some out, but they all seem to fit. This can also be an opportunity to resize things, and I might trim some of the edges. When I'm happy with the layout, I attach it to the journal. You can use glue dots, but I find with very thick paper like this that it's better to use this contact adhesive, or you can use any strong glue that you may have. Mark where you want your paintings to go, and then remove them and add dots of glue to the corners. I find it's better just to attach the corners rather than glue the whole thing, as the paper may be slightly warped, and it seems to work better on the page if you just glue the corners. If the paper is really warped, I will press it under a pile of books before attaching it to the journal, and then I add weights to the corners while it dries. When it's all dry and everything's attached, I add text. I use a thicker pen and this thinner fine liner pen just to add some labels. I like to make a note of all the paints that I've used. If I ever want to use them again, I'll know how they look. I enjoyed using the rough cold pressed watercolour paper. It really holds a lot of paint and you can experiment quite a bit with it. The smooth hot pressed paper is better for detail, and that's usually what I go for. I found that once the shimmer paints had dried, that they really did show up more.